called themselves the Black-Headed People, and the land they controlled, the land of the civilized lords. This is the perceived inventors of human civilization. Sumerians believed that civilization was God's gift of order out of chaos. And yet the most important thing that they identified about themselves was the color of their hair. Their language had already died out about 2000 BC, so more than 4,000 years ago, but it was still used ceremoniously for several more centuries. We know a lot about their culture, and we know that over the thousands of years that they ruled, they wore their hair in many ways. Welcome to the Occult and the Apocalypse with Kristen, aka Fire Terra Mama, where I tell you how they took what was once widely known about God, spirituality, and you and locked it away. Come with me while I show you what I've learned from science, religion, cultural beliefs, and mythology to turn the occult and the apocalypse into just the hidden and the revealed. Now, initially, they shaved their black hair and wore caps with no beards. This was likely related to preventing epidemics of lice, but when the Akkadian and the Babylonian cultures influenced them, we saw women either wear short hairstyles or long braids, while men typically grew out their hair long and had full beards. Later cultural influences by Babylon and Akkadian, they began curling their hair with hot metal rods. Mesopotamians in general were actually really well known for their beards. They wore them long with jewels and beads woven into them. Of course, that was primarily to document who was nobility and who was a commoner. And in many cultures across the world, hair is considered a symbol of socioeconomic status, nobility, and spiritual status and wisdom. Now, the ancient Egyptians believed that hair was a connection to the divine, and in Hinduism, there's a similar sense of connection. Long hair in Hinduism and Buddhism often signifies commitment to a spiritual journey. On the contrary, some Hindu ritual hair cuttings called chatakarana usually takes place during milestones in a person's life. Now, the biblical Samson and some indigenous American tribes identify long hair as the sign of strength and spiritual connectedness. Cutting one's hair could represent a loss of strength and a disconnect to the divine. Now, growing up, I had a best friend whose mother was from Thailand, and I remember being very young, running around her house and reaching out and pulling her hair. And she looked back at me very seriously and told me that I couldn't do that because I could be cursed, essentially. I remember it like it was yesterday. She passed back in 2009, but she was so very serious about it, and I didn't understand at the time. So after doing some digging, it turns out that many traditional East Asian and Asian cultures, your hair contains your ki or vital energy. Cutting it off or pulling it is like losing energy. Spiritually, hair is essentially an antenna to the divine. There are many cultures and spiritual traditions that encourage you to dress or braid your hair in certain ways to ensure protection. And of course, there's many cultures now that have protected hairstyles. In ancient Egypt, something called the side lock of youth or the Horus lock was used by children of the pharaoh. Royal children's heads would be shaved bald entirely except for the side lock. Now, interestingly enough, it achieved central significance as a special symbol of princes and princesses in the 18th dynasty. It was used more in princes before this, but in this dynasty, princesses were also considered potential heirs. Now, I'll remind you that the 18th dynasty gave us Amenhotep III, considered one of the greatest pharaohs that there was. Crown Prince Thutmose, who could also have been the last pharaoh of the dynasty, Horemheb, and potentially Moses, if you caught that episode, as well as Akhenaten, the pharaoh who poorly trialed monotheism in ancient Egypt. We did an episode on that too. And last but not least, King Tut, who's well known across the world. It was typically a long braid on the right side that was braided together and curled, running from around the right temple, and was grown out through youth. Now, in Jewish culture, the Tanakh, which is essentially the Hebrew Bible, it says, "You shall not round off the PA of your head." Now, this word PA is interpreted to mean the front of the ears, extending beneath the cheekbone, keeping level with the nose. This is the payot or payot, okay? And separately, but similarly, many cultures believe that you should be wrapping your hair. Now, when head coverings, particularly for women, are first mentioned is around the 13th century BC in Assyria. Okay, so right around the same time as these other people that I've recently mentioned. The nobility there began wearing them in order to set themselves apart from the commoners. Now, that being said, Egyptians in all but their slave class wore wigs to cover their heads long before that. It was thought to minimize transported lice infections. Much later in the timeline, we see coverings within Catholicism, which my mother still remembers not being allowed to go into a church without wearing a veil. We also saw it in Eastern Orthodoxy, Islam, Judaism, Sikh, and the Amish. It is almost always, whether a male or a female covering, meant to insinuate modesty, connection to the divine, sanctity of the body, but potentially the hair itself, all essentially representing protection and devotion. Head coverings were strongly urged in Chinese culture as well, until the Manchu dynasty imposed hair cutting requirements. Now, from a spiritual perspective, head covering is thought to protect the energy flowing through your crown chakra. Spiritualists will tell you that it's a form of protection. It's also known to enhance clarity and focus on divine connectedness. It can also be viewed as a part of a ritual that creates a sacred space within our bodily vessels. Some do it always, others when they expect an increase in spiritual knowledge or energy, and still others when they feel they're being spiritually exposed in some way. It is just yet another thing to connect to the divine and commune with the divine. And it's been practiced in some capacity throughout all of recorded human history. Now, another practice, usually just attributed to one or a couple of cultures, that is actually more widely used is circumcision, particularly male circumcision. Female circumcision is a human-made, torturous, horrible, useless, terrible thing. But male circumcision also never really made sense to me. Not necessarily the act of circumcision, but the mandate of circumcision from Yahweh. God creates the perfect man and woman, and then millennia later comes to Abraham and tells him to mutilate himself and all of the males within his household, including the servants. It always made me wonder why Yahweh, if he were the creator of all, suddenly requests a manual modification to an already perfect body. But if you're interested in more of that, you can catch my Yahweh episode. You'll know that I have a lot of questions, if you've caught that episode, about the being behind the Tetragrammaton. But unsurprisingly, here we see another link to ancient Egypt. But that's not even its origin. It's just simply the first place that we say a culture adopted it more widespread. And we still have the mummies to prove that it's a lot older. In fact, circumcision goes back a lot, like a lot further than that. In the Bubulus period, which is a classification of rock art which ranged between 10,000 and 14,000 years ago, millennia before writing, there were presumably men drawing penises on rock art. That puts it somewhere between 12,000 BC and 8,000 BC. And in Algeria, there's a carving which appears to capture a male circumcision, which they believe may have been part of a ritual. The practice seems to have spread from Central Sahara towards the south in sub-Saharan Africa, and then towards the east towards the Nile. Evidence from engravings and mummies show circumcision dating to at least 6,000 BC in ancient Egypt and still being practiced in 4,000 BC. It was somewhere after that that the Semites and the Sumerians began practicing it. It appears as though it was an important rite of passage in the distant past, long before Israel split from Canaan, and likely long before Canaan was actually Canaan. It is believed that the followers of the patriarchs of Judaism may have adopted it with the intention of making penile hygiene easier in the desert, where hot sand could become an issue under foreskin. It was also a rite of passage into adulthood for some cultures and may potentially have been a form of blood sacrifice in others, including the Israelites. It was also found among many indigenous people, including the Aboriginal people in Australia. When the Greeks came to ultimate power, they made life very difficult for the Jews, and this was later carried by the Romans as they hated circumcision. It led to a ban on circumcision in an attempt to force assimilation, and then that led to creating all sorts of either partial circumcisions or false foreskins, things like that, in order to not be identified as being circumcised. Now, interestingly enough, circumcision has a ton of health benefits, including reducing the spread of STDs and cancer-causing HPV, as well as reducing UTIs. One of the STD that they say it does help reduce the likelihood of transmitting is HIV. It seems that it's something that developed out of a need for improved health, but it does make you wonder how it was discovered, as well as how it developed into a religious rite as we know it today. Now, something that may seem to really only be in Christianity is baptism, but that has a lot older roots as well. It's believed that baptism came out of the earlier practice of ritual washing and purification written into Judaic law. After the Babylonian captivity, which ranged from 586 to 539 BC, it became law that new converts needed to go through the ritual washing and purification at a mikveh, or a pool filled with naturally sourced water. Before conversion was complete, the convert had to be immersed. Now, when it comes to ritual washing, that is a tale as old as time. It's been seen as an act of purification for the whole body or certain body parts to be washed ritualistically before many acts, but mostly prayer or going into a holy place. It originated in Mesopotamia and has been practiced in Hinduism, Buddhism, Taoism. It was a very important part of Roman culture, ancient Egypt, and later Islam, which requires ritual bathing before prayer. We also see an element of it throughout the tribes of indigenous people across the American continent, as water was an important spirit or aspect of the Great Spirit, yet another tradition scattered amongst cultures around the world. Now, lastly, for this episode, but not the final installment for many episodes like this to come in the future, we're going to talk about the concept of coming to age rituals, which is considered a transition between childhood and adulthood. I want to preface this with saying that I'm going to state the historical facts here. It doesn't in any way, shape, or form represent my own beliefs, and I'm thankful that we now know things like a child isn't an adult until actually the age of 25 when your frontal lobe has fully formed, those sorts of things. But in ancient times, coming to age rituals were usually marked by the onset or completion of puberty. Depending on the culture, it was marked either by the onset or the completion. And boys would either begin some sort of military training, or, as in ancient Egypt, it was linked more to adulthood and thus marriage readiness. The rites or rituals range anywhere from 14 to 17 for Roman boys. However, girls as young as 12 were considered ready for marriage. Boys would give up their toys or their bulla in ancient Rome. That's a protection necklace that they would wear throughout childhood, and switch to a plain white toga. Girls would give up her bulla and her toys going into marriage. Now, Spartan males at the age of 7 were taken to the boarding school with intense military training. They would be there for 13 years. In the last year, around 19, 20 years old, they had the Krypteia, which was a year-long test of living alone in the wilderness. They survived off the land and killing people of the servant class. They were given no weapons or tools and allowed no contact. If they passed, they were Spartan soldiers, and if they failed, they became part of the servant class. I'm actually not going to talk about the Greeks. It started in Crete. It was called pedestry. That's all you need to know. Look it up if you want to know more. In some Mesoamerican cultures, puberty marked the beginning to put away childish things. Once the ceremony was complete and the childish things given away, they could marry. However, parents determined when their children would marry, so when it occurred actually varied, and it was done not on an individual basis, but in a group of kids with the same age range. So maybe a little earlier, maybe a little later, depending on the parent. Now, in the tribe that was misnomered the Aztecs, but they were really the Mexicas, the girls would receive a scar on the hip and the breast when they were ready for school. Boys would get lip plugs right around the same time. They stayed in the school until they were married. They also had specific hairstyles to mark like new phases of youth, okay, or growth. In the Mexica tribe, children, I believe specifically boys, shaved their hair. At 10, boys could begin growing it out and wearing it in a bun. After catching their first enemy warrior, usually around 15, they would cut their hair and leave it only long above the right ear. Now, this would signify moving into adulthood, but they weren't done yet. They actually kept that side of the hair long until they got their second enemy. And once they had their second enemy, they moved from what was considered a feminine hairstyle to a masculine hairstyle. It's very similar in stylization as the Horus lock, which we discussed earlier. I'll tell you, the ties between the American continents and ancient Egypt literally never cease to amaze me. It can truly either only be one of two things. Either they were getting the information from the same source, like a shared base culture or something else, much further back in history, or more likely some sort of trade route or direct contact between the Egyptians and the Americas had to have occurred. And considering what they found in an ancient Egyptian tomb, cocaine and tobacco, That's probably the only answer. Yet nobody seriously researches it, and anybody who does is considered like a pseudoscientist. Now, in Aboriginal culture, the walkabout was performed by teenagers as a transition into adulthood. It happened at the discretion of the elders of the tribe and was undertaken between 10 and 16 years old. The 6-month walk was similar to the Spartan ritual, but without the people unaliving. Now, in China, a tradition in the Zhou dynasty who reigned for almost 800 years, from 1046 BC to 256 BC, had the capping ceremony for boys and the hairpin ceremony for girls. Now, for young men at the age of 20, they had their hair rolled into a bun and a cap was placed on their heads. Now, for girls, this was typically done in between their engagement and their wedding, as early as 15, but no later than 20. A similar hair rolling was applied, and instead of a cap, the girls had a hairpin affixed. Now, according to the Vikings, boys were legally men at 12, and at that age, they could marry. However, most Viking cultures, boys were not considered men until they had lived 15 winters. For the Celts, specifically the Irish Celts, coming of age was a very important and highly religious event. It turned a boy into a warrior. It varied tribe to tribe, but involved going into the wilderness and showing that they were reliable or able to care for themselves. Celts believed that the boy would be helped by the gods and goddesses along the way, and this was not closed to girls. Occasionally a girl would also take on the quest, but it wasn't required either. Now, Judaism has the bar mitzvah and the bat mitzvah at the ages of 13 and 12, respectively. And in the Amazon, there's a tribe that boys have to wear gloves, or they have something placed on their hands that have bullet ants, and they get their hands stung for 10 minutes by bullet ants, and then they are men. At the Amish, at about 16, you have Rumspringa, and that's unsupervised weekends where you can try worldly things. Those that are returning or do return are baptized, and this has to be done before 26. Now, currently, many Hispanic families celebrate the quinceañera at 15. Honestly, the list really goes on, and thankfully, we've morphed away from the concept of adolescents and teens having to take on adult responsibilities, and many of the rituals now are just ceremonious or celebratory in nature. But I really do love the implications of these cultural, religious, and spiritual beliefs being scattered across space and time. Although some of them seem influenced by maybe some of the lower vibrations of the world, others seem to hold a thread of spiritual truth or health implications. Think of the spirituality of hair and the health benefits of circumcision, or the fact that a culture in the Americas carried a similar hairstyle as ancient Egypt. It makes you want to look back at your own culture or religion and ask yourself, why do I believe what I believe? Where does it come from? And who shares the same thoughts or ideas as me? Once you start to ask that, you start to realize that although maybe appearing completely unalike, maybe even completely contrary to one another, most religions or spiritual beliefs are rooted in the same roots. Then you have to ask yourself, how could I be the only one who is right when everything else kind of lines up so similarly? And then maybe, if you're really open, you'll start to think, maybe I haven't fully been told the truth, and I don't fully understand why I believe what I believe. And in that case, start to look outward from your own echo chamber of truth. But I'll leave that for you to think about. Join me next week. We're going to talk about the afterlife in different cultures and what are the other potential like afterlife options really. In the meantime, thank you for helping me bring the occult and the apocalypse into just the hidden and the revealed. I'll see you next week.